And then I will introduce Akilah. So Akilah is an enthusiastic Angular developer with a deep love for all things TypeScript. Her journey includes meaningful contributions to open source projects, including IBM's Call for Code Racial Justice Initiative. As a Code for Atlanta collaborator, she played a role in the Modern Earth project. You may also recognize her as a friendly host on Angular Nation's Beginners channel, where she shares her knowledge and passion for Angular with a few developers starting their coding journey. And tonight, she is going to talk to us about understanding technical documentation for JavaScript developers and the new Angular.Dev. So go ahead and take it away.
Hello, everybody. Today's going to be, it seems like a very simple subject. And sometimes as you progress in your learning journey, it seems almost intuitive. Um, but I find that uh, when I work with newer developers, at least newer than me. I don't have that much experience, but um, they really struggle. Their go-to is to go to a blog or tutorial. And so the reason why I created this, because now I know that learning how to read documentation, at least um, as I know it's for front-end developers or for JavaScript developers, is really a skill. So that's the reason why I was kind of passionate in creating this talk. So first, we're going to go over how to analyze documentation as a JavaScript developer, um, getting comfortable reading it and kind of scanning through. Most of them are pretty common as you get better with reading documentation. And then we're going to talk about the difference between Angular.io and Angular.dev. Angular.dev is the new documentation domain for Angular, and whether you should ditch the old Angular.io, um, and why it was really a really big change for Angular. So yeah. So first we're going to talk about the fundamentals are fundamental. Uh, yeah. And this even goes for me. I think especially as JavaScript developers, um, uh, knowing the fundamentals of JavaScript is important. So let's make sure we know how to declare things, that we know what our data types are. We know how to declare our constants and how to store data, how to work with objects, how to work with arrays, what classes are, because at the end of the day, documentation or when you're working with frameworks and libraries is really you're reading other people's code. And so that's the real root of being good with documentation is um, that you're learning how to read code. And in turn, it makes you a better writer. So when you're working on Angular, I put this, I should have put aristocrat error messages because the compiler is different. So knowing the difference between what JavaScript error messages are, what's TypeScript error messages are, and what's the Angular compiler in particular. Sometimes you don't know if it's different, but knowing at least the fundamentals of reading error messages like the JavaScript error message, and if you're working with TypeScript error messages, it'll help you when you're reading the API of other frameworks and libraries. So let's make sure, or as you get better, um, why learning the fundamentals is very important, and it help you become quicker when you're reading other people's code, because essentially that's what you're doing. Um, Documentation versus tutorials or blogs. We're gonna if you have a feature or even if you just want to, there's nothing wrong with reading tutorials or blogs. There's not one better than the or other, but to me, as you get better, documentation should be the source of truth, because the the people who maintains these frameworks and libraries, they take a lot of time. The Angular teams take so much time to actually come up with these APIs, looking at feedback. They're very thoughtful. You read, sometimes you watch, like YouTube videos and things, and they talk about these frameworks, and They kind of talk about it like the team is just writing things and they don't really know about syntax and paradigms, and they're just like, yeah, this is right, this is bad. But honestly, especially with the Angular team, I've talked to a few people from the Angular team, and they are very thoughtful when they're maintaining and writing these frameworks. So the documentation should be the source of truth. I think that should be the first source that you go to kind of figure out how things work. Usually not, like I said, I mean, if you have a feature, you see something quicker but as you get better reading documentation, I think that should be the first thing you should read. Secondly, you once you learn how to read code, because I think, at least because documentation isn't limited to, coding or programming languages. If you look at OpenAI, it has a documentation. And so, as far as JavaScript, yeah, that's what I speak towards. And TypeScript, you're reading others people's code. So that's the thing I think that should be, um, the most important if you don't get anything else out of this. And so once you get comfortable reading other people's code, you really feel like you can learn anything quickly. And so you're not so bogged down or so with because we have to learn a lot as software engineers. But once you start getting comfortable reading documentation, you start feeling confidence that you can learn anything. And you will start to read code as well as you write it. And like I said, I'm repeating myself because I think that is the skill set that people don't appreciate when reading documentation, when you probably go for the tutorials or the blogs first. One of the reasons why is it feels quicker sometimes to get to that solution or implementation because you haven't developed the skill of reading other people's code. And sometimes reading other people's code doesn't mean that people talk about documenting their own code or writing readable or clean code. And I'm preaching to myself that sometimes the reason why the code isn't clear is because there's an indicator of your own learning gap, and um that sometimes it's not the documentation or whether it's clean or messy code. Sometimes it's just your own gap of learning that's preventing you from reading that documentation or reading other people's code. So that's usually why this skill is very important. Um, Not all documentation is created equal. Um, like I said, sometimes it is quicker to go to that blog or tutorial. Especially that's what it felt like when reading the Angular documentation. That was one of the biggest arguments against it, is that it depended on who you talk to, that the documentation was hard to read. So it's very complex. And really, the reason why it was complex is because it's really a very powerful framework. It wants to do a lot of things, and it can do a lot of things, and it wants to solve a lot of problems out the box when you're working um, in the browser. And technical jargon. Just because you don't understand the jargon doesn't mean that it's a badly written documentation. Sometimes, like I said, if there's a lot of terminologies that you don't understand or a lot of jargon, sometimes use it as an indicator that there's a learning gap, right? That was one of the problems that I had when I first was reading the documentation, is that I think not so much now. I think TypeScript is a little bit more used than it was when I first started learning. But you see things like decorators and components and directives, and you see this jargon, and you see the dependency injection. Like, you hear those words that actually are not uh, subjective to Angular. Dependency injection is a pattern, right? It's a regular programming pattern. Even reactivity or reactive code or observables, the observer pattern. These are things that are not exclusive to Angular, but they're programming patterns. So Don't always write off documentation that may have a lot of jargon as badly documented. Sometimes it's just an indicator of where your own learning is. And if you have the time to kind of write notes and um, you know, maybe write down those terminologies, um, it'd be easier for you to read. Um, their long Angular documentation definitely was very lengthy and very comprehensive, as it should be, because it wants to solve a lot of problems. um I'm not going to go over all of it because I think I'll repeat myself. Like the assumed knowledge gap, documentations can often assume prior web development, and it should, depending on the solution that it's trying to solve. One of the reasons why documentation isn't created equals because it's not trying to solve, it's trying to solve different problems. Angular has a different paradigm than React, and React has a different paradigm to Svelte, and it depends on your own programming background, right? And so um yeah, when you read these documentations and you want to learn a new software, you should look to see what's the objective, what's the point of this software or framework or library. That's where I'm speaking from as a JavaScript developer, and figure out um what's its purpose. And then a lot of the documentation will have examples and pre-written code, and we'll go over that. But yeah, everybody has a different learning preference. Everybody has different approaches to the way that they learn. And so just recognize that within yourself when you're trying to learn something new while reading documentation. All right. And there is nothing basic about the basics. So after you get the fundamentals of your own programming language, or especially for us as JavaScript or TypeScript and sometimes CSS, most documentation is kind of written the same, right? A little bit. Um, they have get started. Do not underestimate the hello worlds. You will get a lot out of just the first section of documentation, just writing how to just work with the first few sections of documentation. So identify key sections, quick starts, how to get started with it quickly. Look for the goals, the objectives, and the key features. This is where you get the heart of what the documentation or the software or language, um, what what does it solve and what it can solve for you, right? So yeah, so just get used to reading those first few sections of any documentation, and uh, how to get started. All right. Yes. So understand the framework basics, the structure, the table of contents, um, look at the difference that where they will have the API, what they call API reference. That's where the fundamentals of just learning what classes and objects. So what methods do they have? Do they like to write it functionally? Do they want to use classes or using objects? And just seeing they're usually troubleshooting. Sometimes they have a section just for troubleshooting, depending on what documentation you're working with. And so just get familiar with just the foundations of any most JavaScript or TypeScript frameworks, and looking at those structures. All right, so for me, the fun stuff beyond the basics, leveraging documentation for mastery. One thing about watching tutorials and blogs, sometimes you feel like, how in the heck do they know this stuff? How are they getting the gems and the stuff that you just don't usually see? And I guarantee you the best teachers are very, very good at reading documentation. And so they can find those hidden gems, those unknown things, of those really special things to work with the framework and where it is. So get used to looking for those hidden gems and the advanced sections. Pay attention to parameter descriptions and data types. As once we start looking at the difference between Angular.io and Angular.Dev, they have like key legends and things like that. And one of the things that I had difficulty with reading documentation is how they will have something like property types, methods, classes, how to import things. So working with ES modules, and we might look quickly at material UI. And so take advantage of documentation. That is how you become a guru. That's, or I look like a guru. Uh, at the very least, is really because the documentation is the source of truth, right? That is where the information lies. So you should be able to learn more from documentation than you would any tutorial and blog. And I think that if you want to really learn the software or language that you're working with, like I said, the documentation should be that source of truth. So take advantage of all the information that they put there, and figure out, the niche of the document, of the framework or software that you're working with by looking for those hidden gems, looking for those advanced things. All right, the documentation of documentation. And that's the repo. That's where you really start to feel more advanced in reading code. Is if you read the repo of the language or the software that you're reading. Go to the GitHub. Angular has a very public, it's open source, so it's very public. And you can read to see how they implement things. And what's fun is, if you start reading it, you can see that they use Angular to implement Angular features. So you can see how they use inputs and directives and buttons and selectors. And when you start getting to things like content projection, how they use content projection in Angular itself. So as you get better at learning how to read code, you can read the repo of the repo, and the documentation of the documentation, and that is usually the repository or the Git that they have. So read it and fork it, try to analyze it. That's something that I'm trying to get better at. I think one of my big goals is to do a PR on the Angular repo. So that is a, a big lengthy goal for me, and it's a lot of learning that I have to do before I feel like I can do that. So if you spot any errors, and provide suggestions for more accurate content. Yeah, so you know, the documentation has errors and has things and so as you get better at writing code and you read the code and you see, hey, that doesn't look right. I don't think that would work. Did they mean to write that? And so push the community forward if you can and contribute to those things. So it's all an effort and learning and pushing the web forward. All right. So Angular.Dev versus Angular.io. What is the difference? Should I stop using Angular.io? I'm going to just answer that now. And I think as of right now, no. And I'll show you the reason why. Yeah. So just going quickly on what's the differences before I go to that, and do it really quickly. What's the differences? So the documentation focused for Angular.io is going to be up to version 17. I think the latest version they did maybe a few weeks ago is 17.2. And Angular.dev is from now going forward, it's going to be for version 17 and above. So if you're working with legacy code, you should still go to Angular.io. It's stable and more mature, which means that it has been maintained the longest. Angular.dev is still dynamic and evolving. They're still getting feedback. It's very new. If you read it, it's still in beta. So it's changing. It's not as stable as the content that's on Angular.io. Updates. They're not going to really be updating much on the new Angular.io. I think Angular.dev from now going forward is going to be the main source for Angular information, the documentation for Angular.dev. So you're going to see when they start having new features and adding new things, Angular.dev is going to be your new source, and they're going to gradually change that to be the main domain for Angular. And I won't repeat that because that's what current status means. So future plans for it is that Angular.Dev is going to be the official home. That's what they want. And that's what's happening. Angular.Dev is the new Angular home. Okay. So that's enough of the slides. And let me get better doing this. So let's actually look at Angular. So I have this here, and one of the reasons why I say that you still should be using Angular.io over Angular.dev. As you can see here, I'm sitting here, I'm reading, trying to read how to make dynamic components. I'm still learning myself, and you go to the API reference, and you see these links. Oh, this is interesting. Navigate the component tree with DI. You go there, page not found, right? It doesn't work. And so, yeah, all the links and then when I went to Angular.io, it's a good reason for that. Mark for archiving. To ensure that you have the best experience possible, this is marked until we determine that it clearly conveys the most accurate information. In the meantime, this topic might be helpful, hierarchical injectors, right? And then they have the GitHub issue here. So as you can see, I personally wouldn't ditch Angular.io. It still has a lot to give. It still has a lot of information, and they're still working on Angular.dev. But what I would, if you're just learning Angular, if you're new to Angular, Angular.dev is the place to go. Is the place to be. They really cater it. I just got Angular.dev. Yeah, they really catered Angular.dev to beginners and first end users, which is really good because that was really one of the biggest, I guess, arguments against is that the documentation is really hard to read. Um, Now that I've gotten better, I don't really believe that to be true. I just think that where the learning journey begins for new developers is a lot different. So it became a lot harder. It's a lot more self-taught developers like myself, and I don't necessarily know things like design patterns, and which is not a bad thing. I think that's like I said, it's a good indicator. It's not bad that um that you that they cater because it's different solutions, right? Everything cannot be catered toward beginners because beginners not always trying to solve the problems that more advanced people or more, working or whatever are trying to solve. So, but they heard and they said, well, let's revamp it. So they have these tutorials and playground. You can now work with it inside the browser, which is really cool. The way that I think I like the reference, um API references the better on Angular.io than I do Angular.dev. But let's at the very least look at this menu here. See what time it is. This menu here at the docs, right? And as you can see, introduction. The all Angular.io had what they call the hero app, and it was this thing, but it wasn't very clear on what you were learning. Wasn't very clear on how much you were learning, what was the fundamentals. It just felt like they just wanted to get your feet wet and you were just following this tutorial. As far here, now they have like the essentials. Now you know what is the most basic and fundamental things we're working with Angular, and I think it works a lot better than it did in Angular.io. I think it's very clear of where to work with the framework as a beginner and how much you should know to just get started. So I like that a lot more on the Angular.dev, and then they take you back to the end browser. So you can just start working with it right away. I don't think this is very clear. I'm not. Once you go to it, maybe, but working with the IDE isn't very clear. But I do appreciate the effort that they put towards that. So yeah. So first you have the introduction, and then you have the in-depth guides right here. So you can think of this as their own individual I'll say textbook. You look at the components, and you literally could maybe take, if you wanted to learn Angular in a year, go through each section, maybe take a day to go through each section, and you learn a lot very quickly. It's very clear on how and what's most important to each of these libraries and features that they have for this framework. So you have the in-depth guides, and if you look down below, you have the developer tools. So how to work with the CLI, how to create libraries and dev tools, and work with the language service. So as you get even more advanced, you can see how to work with. I kind of like the Angular.io way where they actually have the own documentation for the Angular CLI and working with libraries and the dev tools, because it's kind of in depth. It's kind of the same thing here. But as you can see at the menu on Angular.io, it's not as clear. It just kind of have everything kind of sectioned out. And then you see here developer guides and then understanding Angular, and it's not very clear like why do they have that separate right like that. If you're trying to look at something specific and you see component directives and then you have the developer guides where they show like standalone, is this supposed to be like more advanced, or it's not very clear um of why they sectioned that off like that. Um and I don't think I went over everything. I feel like I'm missing a slide. That's okay. One of the things I did want to talk about is using what they call the key legends. I think. All right, well, let's just look at some code on here, right? And I think I'm gonna go to Material UI. Um, and let's just go to button. And before I go to that, my family is coming in from church. I am going to take 1 second to close the door. Give me one moment.
We pause for this momentary interruption till Akilah closes her door.
All right. I apologize for that. Um, yeah. So I want to go to the key legends and which I think is ah, this is how it looks like on Angular.io. And if you go to, all right, so you see this API list here. And let's look at Angular.io first. So they have these types. So if you look at these color buttons right here, it tells you what each API is, right? So you can see here that this is animated as a function. And so one of the things that really frustrated me that I didn't really, and that was my not lack of knowledge of like TypeScript. You see here, just reading it, not knowing what it is, you can see that that's a function, and then you have this timings here, right? So the parameters, the timings, and then you have string or number, and then you see this other thing here, right? And this is also types, right? And so when you're reading the API, this is where fundamentals, even for myself, I'm speaking for myself, really come in. And how to read these things is that you can see that they have what it is, right? So this is a C, so that's a class. This is an interface. And so that gives you a very clear indication of how the API works and what's its use case is, right? So if you see that it's an interface, you know, not really working directly with it, right? That means that this should look a certain way. They expect the animation keyframe sequence to be architectured a certain way. So you can clearly see the intention of the API by looking to see where it is. And Angular was very good with doing that. So you see here, hey, if you see B, it's just a block of code. K is a constant. That means it's something that is not immutable, it's not changing, and it's also probably primitive. So it's probably just a value versus it doing something. If it's a decorator, you know it's attached to another function or class. Usually in Angular, when working with decorators, it's used to decorate a class so that you know that is extra information for something else. So learning how to use the key codes and the key legends is very useful in um, learning how to read the API. All right, so now we can go to So when you're looking at the documentation, right, and this used to be very difficult, but API reference for Angular material button. This right here, right, is importing something from something. So this right here is a TypeScript alias, right? If you learn how to work with aliases, but that's not that important. But you know, this is not um exclusive to Material or Angular, right? This is just how to work with ES modules. So you're just importing something, right? But then when you go down, you see directives. What is a selector? How does a selector look in a Angular component, or components are directives? Well, what are Angular directives? And so you see the selector, usually it looks like it's an element, and you have like a little selector inside the element. Once you start working with Angular, that becomes a lot more clearer. So you can read this very quickly and know probably how it's being used. You got the fundamentals out the way, you know the fundamentals of Angular, the framework itself, and so you know the intentions behind it. You probably have some type of element that is going to be manipulated through the selector. You have the properties. You see here that it's an input, right? How do you work with Angular inputs in the description? Um, and so as you get better reading documentation, these things become a lot easier and a lot quicker, and you don't have to depend on the examples or tutorials or blogs. Uh, and I think that's it. Um, yeah, and I'll do this talk again, and hopefully I can kind of convey what I wanted to teach a lot better. But I think the most important thing that I wanted to get out of this is that um, that documentation, at least for JavaScript or TypeScript developers, for the most part, is just reading other people's code. And you should use that as the time to get better writing code, and really take the time to just read. I know this gonna sound weird, but read documentation for fun or for learning, and just read it without even trying to learn things, so that you it's just a really good indicator of where you are as a developer. So I'll end it there. Okay.
Great, thank you. I'm actually curious, how many people, Angular developers out there are on Angular 17 and actively using Angular 17? Anybody? I know
Uh,
we're not.
yeah, I'm
So
actually using it. Yeah, for a storybook application we're working in-house.
Oh, cool. Yeah, we're not. We're actually on 13, trying to upgrade to 16 right now, I think. But yeah. And I'd forgotten that there was actually a new set of documentation. I looked at it after the conference, I think it was, because I think they introduced it at the conference. And I forgot about it. And thank you for reminding me that there's actually a new set of documentation coming.
Yeah, sometimes you think that everyone knows this information, right? When you're in the world of learning, you're like, this is boring, but I find that to be true a lot. And I didn't even get to go through everything, like the how they do the versioning and release updates. I was like, man, this is not, I have to really learn how to condense this. I didn't really think this was that in depth, but it really
Yeah.
is.
And I hadn't thought about it, but I also liked your suggestion about going to GitHub and looking to see how they did it.
Yeah.
I it's
Especially material, like when you look at Angular material, how to use content protection, it's really fun to see how they're using Angular. Because you're
yeah,
like, oh, this is okay to do. This is what they're doing. So if they're doing it, I guess, it's okay for me to do it. I found myself.
I live on Material Angular IO. I live on this site, but not so much to Angular, but I'm gonna start using it more often and pay more attention to that. Do we have any questions for Akilah?
Yeah, I do have a question. So with the application we're building out, Storybook, and with me being very passionate about our users and making sure that it conveys and they can understand. So when we build out this UI and we're building the documentation, the challenge I'm faced with is how to write the documentation so the new people on the team can quickly understand, but also be able to work with what are seasoned developers if they quickly need to just kind of something for a reference. And so that's one thing that's been a little challenging for me is how to kind of effectively write documentation that could help both. With me being a little bit more senior, 7 years in that's something that I have to constantly work on because I might just go and say, derivative or director, and the other person might not know exactly what that is, or observables or things like that. So I guess that's my question is how do you effectively write documentation that not only supports new or new developers to a team versus seasoned developers.
I guess that goes to the part I said about the fundamentals are fundamental and knowing what you're writing. So if you know that API implements a directive, right? Maybe you can write not a very in-depth definition, but at least maybe a reference to, hey, this is a directive, refer back to this, and knowing what you are writing. If this is a class that implements a method or something like that, then maybe you should come up with key legends like class. And so then they can look up, oh, this is a method. So if I know that it's a class and a method, it's going to be encapsulated code, right? So they know the difference between, like I said, with the interface. If you're looking at an interface, you know that it doesn't directly work with the code. This is what they want the code to at least look like or to implement. And then you can look at the types. So I think that just being very mindful of the type definitions that you use and knowing how you're writing the code is really the best way to describe it, is to think of the documentation as how to write a book. So if it's not very clear on what the API is, it might be maybe how the API is written. So I mean that's kind of hard to tell because in some ways I want to be, and this is I'm not the expert, but where it's kind of like, you need to know, learn your fundamentals and learn how to read code. And there's also the fundamentals, like you need to know what you're writing when other people read it. I don't know if that's very clear, but I just think that being more mindful of what's being defined, maybe using more like definitions, and put class, if you can, put classes with classes, put directives with directives. And when you're writing a code, it probably just going to take you a minute to kind of make sure that you're writing the code as if someone is reading it. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Because we have onboarding, and that's the other thing that we're trying to figure out the best way to communicate for people that are onboarding when they go and look at our UI library, to kind of look at what our our guidelines are, things like that. That it's something that can be hopefully easily digestible, or like you're saying. But the other thing too is we also don't want to have to have so much links away from it to that too. So we're kind of in that situation where we're trying to figure out what's the right amount of navigating into an external site versus like breaking it down in there too as well. So, but yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.